Okay, this is a video that I think for me is long overdue. Um, you know, we live in such an interesting era of Star Wars. Um, Safe to say, such a divisive era of Star Wars. And I think this is such an interesting topic because this is a topic that everybody discusses when talking Star Wars. Is it which is worse, prequels or the sequels of Star Wars? And I think that the thing is with that is the sequels in some aspects. And by the way, obviously, the original trilogy is the best Star Wars content out there, in my opinion. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking sequels versus prequels to be second place. You know, getting the silver medal versus the bronze. You know what I mean? And a lot of people, um, I think say sequels. I think you look at a lot of people, and I think honestly, I don't think it's the majority. I think it's a very vocalized group that believe the sequels are better, or not sequels. Sorry, prequels are better. You know, I think there's a very vocalized group that hate the new films, hate the Disney films. And I think I personally, I don't think all the Disney Star Wars films are bad. I like Rogue One. I think honestly, the thing about Force Awakens is I like Force Awakens, but the problem is everything I like about the Force Awakens gets undone by the later films. Everything great that was set up in this first film felt undone later in the film. So it's hard to rewatch this film and still have the same enjoyment when you just know a lot of it's gonna get um cut or or change, you know, and how a lot of things that were set up in this film were in many ways botched and contradicted in the later films. A lot of it, especially Rise of Skywalker. And a lot of people criticized The Last Jedi and Ryan Johnson for changing things up when he didn't. J.J. Abrams was very vocal about Rey was supposed to be a nobody. That was the point. Rey was supposed to be a nobody. That was what he thought. That was what everybody thought. She was gonna be a nobody. That's what they planned. So Ryan Johnson, I think, in many ways was trying to carry out what J.J. Abrams was trying to do. I'm not saying I like Rise of Skywalker, or not right. Yeah, sorry. No, I'm not saying I like The Last Jedi that much. I mean, I like parts of it. I don't really like the Cannonbite stuff. But I think the stuff about Rey being nobody didn't really bother me. Snoke is a good reason why I don't really do a lot of fan theories, because I'm like, you could fan theorize all you want, but I'm just like, I'm gonna see how the film and the story goes. So I get that if a lot of people are theorizing about Snoke, and it did subvert your expectations. The stuff about Luke being kind of the way he is, I think it would be. I don't mind that Luke threw the lightsaber back, but I have a problem if that's gonna be your cliffhanger. Because why make that your cliffhanger if it's just the beginning of a joke? You know, it's just literally the cliffhanger just ends with a low hanging fruit joke, and I think that's kind of interesting. I think, but overall, Last Jedi was very mixed for me. So I really liked Force Awakens, but it's kind of neutered by the contradictoriness of the later films. I think Last Jedi I like parts of it. Now the Rise of Skywalker I didn't like, because the problem with the Rise of Skywalker for me is how it was a big course correct, because it felt like the studio trying to please the people that didn't like the Last Jedi, but instead made everybody hate it, because instead they didn't give justice to any of the groups. There's the people that liked The Last Jedi. There's the people that are mixed on Last Jedi, and then there's people that hated The Last Jedi. And they unite, and I think pretty much the majority didn't like this film because I think, well, I mean, I don't think majority, I don't know the statistic, but I think what they failed upon is just continue the story. It doesn't matter what the fans think. Continue the story. You're the filmmakers. And so instead, they're like, no one liked that Rey was a nobody? Oh my god, we better make her a somebody. Oh my god, they didn't like Rose? Let's cut Rose out of the film. Oh my god, Oh, nobody liked that Snoke was killed? Let's bring a new big baddie in the Emperor. And it's just kind of like, instead of going where the story looked like it was going, they course corrected. And I think they were dealt a bad hand. I get it, with the death of Carrie Fisher. I get it. That was gonna be tough because I'm pretty sure the script was already written, and it's so tough to know what they should have done with that. It's such a touchy subject with that. But I just think the execution was bad, and it retread ideas, and it brought new ideas that made no sense, had no setup, had no plan. And I think this was where you could tell they had no plan. They were just like, let's just cram ideas just to end this, and it was just because, and you could tell. So I think it was a hot mess of a film. The Rise of Skywalker really was. But how does it compare to the prequels? See, this is my thing with the prequels. If I give you the Coles notes of the prequels about this boy who meets these masters, and his master was going to train him but gets killed by a Sith Lord, and then there's this galactic war starting, and his new master starts training him, and they go on these adventures, they have arguments, and anger starting to build up with the Padawan, and all this stuff culminates to the rise of the Empire, the fall of Anakin, the turn to Vader, Padme and Anakin's story. If I give you the Coles notes of the prequels, you would say, wow, this is a very fascinating story. And I've done this to people who have no idea what this film is. And I just detail this tragedy. And I think the thing is, the story for the prequels is not bad at all. I'd say the story for the prequels is really strong. If I just tell you the story of what happens from 1, 2, and 3, you would be like, this is a very fascinating story. But this is a good case. The prequels are a good case of a good story, but bad execution. And I think this is another problem, is this is a good case study to see what happens when you give one person, and one person only, all creative control. Because George Lucas, coming off of Indiana Jones and Star Wars, was the king of the hill. You know, George Lucas was huge. He had Lucasfilm. He had making so much money off of Star Wars. He was a hot commodity, George Lucas. So if he's about to make a Star Wars film, he's gonna make a Star Wars film exactly how he wanted. And especially because it was all produced by his own company, there was no hierarchy to oversee this all. That wasn't George Lucas. And so, guess what happened? George Lucas was surrounded by people that didn't really share their own opinion, but rather just agreed with him. You know, because this probably is a real scenario. You look at these behind-the-scenes things. They would literally come up to George would say, "Oh, do you like this idea? Do you like this scene with the sand and all that stuff with Padme and Anakin?" Yes, George. And guess what? If they said no, you're out. You're out. You know, because he's surrounded by people that would agree with him. They were no use to George Lucas. It was do what I ask, or you're out of here. You know what I mean? I think that was the truth. And I think George Lucas is such a great storyteller. Or not storyteller, but he has such great stories and ideas and concepts. But his problem is, I think, in execution. Because think about this. George Lucas did not direct Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi. Think about that. It was someone else. I think a lot of people forget about that. But believe me, he had more creative control than most writers and creators. You know what I mean? Because normally the director is the king on set for most films. But here, no, George Lucas was the king of the hill. George oversaw, Ivan Kershner and everything he did. And Richard Marquand, I think was his name, who directed Return of the Jedi. George Lucas, someone else directed the original Star Wars film, the final two, Empire and Return of the Jedi. Yeah, someone else directed them. But don't be mistaken, George Lucas had more creative control than most writers and creators. He did. But still, someone else directed them. And there's stories out there that he did not actually direct the the actors. You know what I mean? He had a specific director to direct the actors. So the point is, George Lucas's strong suit is in the stories, creating the concepts, creating where the story is going to go. Because the thing that gets the prequels better than the sequels in some aspects is that in the prequels they actually had a plan. These, like them or hate them, the prequels feel like three cohesive films. You watch the sequels, they don't really feel like three cohesive films. You can clearly feel three distinct tones, three distinct moods, three distinct directions in each of the sequel films. Whereas the prequels, they have the same tone, the same feel. You can tell they're one continuous story, 1, 2, and 3. But why I say the execution isn't all there? Because the acting is not perfect. The script is not perfect by no stretch of the imagination. In some of the characters, Jar Jar Binks, let's just say, were not the best. Now, I believe Revenge of the Sith is better than all three sequel films. I believe that. But I do not believe The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones are better than any of the sequel films. Maybe Rise of Skywalker. Because as a Star Wars fan, I kind of have big reservations with The Rise of Skywalker. But other than that, I do think The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones are probably worse than any of the sequel films. And I'm not talking about Rogue One or Solo. That's not sequel. I'm talking about specifically Force Awakens, Rise of Skywalker, and The Last Jedi. And I think what's tricky is they're kind of tied for me, personally. Because I feel like as a Star Wars fan, The Rise of Skywalker rubs me the wrong way a bit. But at the same time, I think Force Awakens and The Last Jedi are way better made than Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. I personally think that 2 out of the 3 sequel films are better made, not saying that I like them more, better made than the prequel films. And I think the problem with the sequels is that they have no plan. Because it doesn't matter how good I might think The Force Awakens is, when the story... Because Force Awakens is a part 1 to clear 3-part stories. Force Awakens just feels like a part 1. And it's hard to really enjoy that film when everything that I felt like the story was going just from this film, by the end, was completely contradicted. Oh, it looks like Rey's a nobody? Yeah, throw that out. Oh, it looks like Kylo Ren's truly evil after killing my favorite movie character in Han Solo? Nah, he's gonna turn good. And that's the problem with me having big criticisms with The Rise of Skywalker. It affects my enjoyment of the trilogy as a whole. Whereas the prequels, they end on, honestly, I think a real high note. And honestly, I really think the Revenge of the Sith saved that trilogy. Because while I didn't particularly like the first 2 parts, where it ended up felt not redeeming of the other films, but felt like a satisfying conclusion to this story. And I think the Revenge of the Sith was the why behind why the prequels were made. Because the premise of the prequels were to show the rise and fall of Anakin Skywalker and how he became Darth Vader. That's the purpose of the prequels, and as an extension of that, the fall of the Jedi and the rise of the Empire, collectively into a set of 3 films. And they did that. You showed whether the execution was good or not. They did show the rise of Anakin Skywalker, the rise of the Jedi, the rise of this Clone Wars. And maybe the reason why I can enjoy a film like Revenge of the Sith more is because I love Clone Wars. Because it has an accurate portrayal of Anakin and Obi-Wan and Padme and all these characters. Whereas in Attack of the Clones, they always portrayed Anakin and Obi-Wan as just a Jedi and a Padawan, always bickering, always arguing. But I think maybe it's because I really liked Clone Wars that was able to see this relationship in a different light, which by the end of Revenge of the Sith, I cared when all this stuff happened. And maybe I give that too much credit to the prequels when I shouldn't. And I think the problem is, I think with the prequels I think it's just not, particularly the first two films, were just not well made. You know what I mean? I just think poor quality. And I think what I describe as both the prequels and the sequels were missed opportunities. Because I can go back into Phantom Menace and find ways to fix the film. Because the acts of the film are not bad. It's just pluck Jar Jar out. Maybe make Anakin a little bit older, you know? Keep the pacing a little bit better. And then other than that, I think there's ways to fix it. And I think that I can say the same thing about the sequels. There are stuff in the sequel films you can probably fix. And I think that starts with having a plan. That starts by laying out your 3 films. And honestly, having one director for all 3 films. I think it was a huge mistake by Lucasfilm to say, hey, Rian Johnson come in here. Have J.J. Abrams start. Have Rian Johnson, have the second part. And then they were supposed to have, Colin Trevorrow do the 3rd film. And then they got J.J. Abrams for a course correct. And it was just, they should have had one director, or at least one creative force to oversee it. Like, take the original Star Wars trilogy, for example. George Lucas did not direct all 3 films. We discussed this early in the video. But he was the creative force over all 3 films. The creative visionary over all 3 films. He was the kingpin. Because even though he didn't direct Empire and Return of the Jedi, if there was something that one of those directors directed that George didn't like, it didn't matter. They had to redo the scene. And so I think they just didn't have a creative head to guide all 3 films. And I think that was a problem. Because when you have, a bunch of different creative heads with a bunch of different ideas of where the story should go and what the tone should be, then that could get convoluted and rushed. Or not rushed, but could be lackluster. Because when you think of the greatest trilogies of all time, what's the common theme? One creative head. Dark Knight trilogy. Christopher Nolan was the head of that trilogy throughout the whole entire time. Indiana Jones, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, that team carried out the whole trilogy. Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson was the head of that trilogy the whole time. Star Wars, the original Star Wars films, and the prequels, George Lucas headed it all the same time. Now, that doesn't mean one person should have all the creative control. That was proven by the prequels. George Lucas had all the creative control, and I don't think that should have happened. There should have been other people to give their insight for George to listen to, but that doesn't mean there shouldn't be one person to oversee it creatively. Yes, Kathleen Kennedy is the head of Lucasfilm. Yes, she oversaw the company, but she oversaw the company in a business point of view. Whereas, I think there had to have been someone else to guide all 3 films from a creative standpoint, where I think they did it. And I think that's where that can become an issue. So, and this is a lengthy conversation, kind of comparing the two, and it's going to continue. I'm going to continue on. So we talked about the idea of not having a plan and having a plan. We talked about creative control. We talked about having different directors, different creative heads. But I think there's more to it than that. And I think we also have to keep in mind the hype between both trilogies. You gotta keep into the hype. And I was not alive for the prequels, but just think about this. 1983, Return of the Jedi came out. Everybody thought at the end of that film, that's it. Star Wars is done. Bing, bam, boom. New Hope, Empire, Return of the Jedi, done. And before that, it wasn't even called A New Hope, you know? It wasn't even called Episode 4, 5, and 6. So, everybody thought, you know, all these fans of Star Wars, they thought Star Wars is done. Star Wars is over. You know, beyond, with the exception of games and books, Star Wars is done as far as canon. Canon wasn't even a thing, but as far as movies, as far as pure entertainment, with except the odd book or the odd video game, you know, and that's where kind of the EU was born. But, so figuring out that George Lucas was gonna make more Star Wars films, you can only imagine the fans going nuts when they figured out more Star Wars films. Are you crazy? And George Lucas is coming back? Whoa. You know what I mean? So I think when they first heard about the prequels, I'm sure everybody was excited and their hype was at an all-time high. You know what I mean? People were stoked for the prequels. Stoked. Because it was more Star Wars, and no one thought they were going to get more Star Wars films. And so you gotta keep in mind the sheer excitement of the film. You know, you gotta imagine people were thinking it's going to be up to par with the original. People were thinking all this crazy stuff about this film. And so to see it and get this subpar film probably was a huge letdown. You know what I mean? And I think you can create comparisons to the sequels. Because, yes, there was Clone Wars and Rebels. But beyond that, the last time we had seen a Star Wars film was 10 years prior, in 2005. So to hear the news, not only is Star Wars coming back with a whole new trilogy, but that the original cast was coming back. This is my generation. This is what I went through. Hearing that the original cast was coming back for these Star Wars films blew my mind. I'm going to see my favorite characters back on screen, however old or young. Oh my god. That blew my mind. As young as I was, I loved Star Wars. And so to figure out not only more Star Wars films on their way, but it's going to be with the original cast, oh my god. And I think it wasn't just me. It was my generation. It was generations before me, and generations. Because Star Wars has always been a multi-generational thing. There's the people that were fathers when Star Wars came out that are now grandfathers. And there are people that were kids when Star Wars came out that are now fathers. And now they're their kids. Now they're my generation that grew up on the originals, sequels, and now, more specifically, Clone Wars. And now we get to invest and move on into the sequels. So to watch The Force Awakens, and I guess I'd say that The Force Awakens was a very big disappointment for me as when I watched the film, mainly because Han died, and Han was my favorite character, and it took me some time to get over that. And when I would rewatch The Force Awakens, I would intentionally fast forward the scene where Han died. I know, I was pretty crazy. Han was my favorite. But then also I was underwhelmed by how much screen time the original cast would have. I didn't know that Luke was only going to be a mere cameo. Whatever. But, and disappointment does not mean I didn't like it, because Force Awakens, I think, is the best film in the Disney Star Wars era, personally. A lot of it gets undone by the contradictory nature of The Rise of Skywalker, but I still enjoyed The Force Awakens. It felt like Star Wars. I think whether you like it or not, in the direction that it went. To me personally, I know, I get it. It gets a lot of criticism for being too similar for The Force Awakens gets a lot of criticism for being too similar to A New Hope, but I think that's what makes it work. Is that it just feels like Star Wars, and I think you can't say the same thing about some of the other later films. But so anyways, I think you can make comparisons that about from Force Awakens to Phantom Menace. You can make comparisons between the two because both films was so hyped, was so excited. People were so excited to see this film because it was both decades after the previous film in that franchise in Star Wars. For the Force Awakens case, it had been 10 years, and for the Phantom Menace to come out, it had been 16 long years. I cannot imagine being alive for the original trilogy films and then to wait to see 16 years in between. 16 years without any thought that there would ever be more Star Wars films, to figure out that there would be more Star Wars films, and to see that it turns out, yeah, that Star Wars film was for Phantom Menace and it wasn't particularly great. But, it is what it is in that department of things. And I think this is kind of an interesting conversation. I think it goes larger than anything else. And I think Star Wars fandom, is a toxic place in some places. And I think the problem is just the bar that the original trilogy set. That's the truth. Is because love or hate Star Wars films beyond the original trilogy, the original trilogy is here. Every other Star Wars film is at a minimum here. You know what I mean? And I think Star Wars beyond the original trilogy, Star Wars films beyond the original trilogy, is nowhere near. Because the original Star Wars films just are magical with how the craft and how good it is. And so I think, what I think you have to keep in mind is that I don't think any Star Wars film, and you could quote me on this in the future, I don't think any Star Wars film will ever be as good as those original films. And that's the truth. And I think the problem is comparing these films, whether it be the prequels or the sequels, to the original Star Wars films, because it just doesn't compare. For some reason, the magic isn't there to make these films, because I think Star Wars is such a thing of magic, and I think it's such multi-generational, and I think because a lot of people have grown up on Star Wars, they take this Star Wars, point is, people are passionate about it. People care. And I think I'm not going to hate on anyone who likes any Star Wars film. Star Wars is Star Wars, and I can find enjoyment in any Star Wars film. Because it's Star Wars. Because whether you see the Millennium Falcon, or you see Han, or Luke, I will still get excited. As dumb as seeing Han Solo and Ben Solo connect in the Rise of Skywalker. It didn't matter. I got to see Harrison Ford as Han Solo again. It didn't matter. I still loved seeing him back. But yet again, I don't think that scene was necessary. And I think that's the problem. Is I just think we need something in the fandom to unite us. And I think that's what The Mandalorian has done. And I think to answer the question, which is better, the prequels or the sequels, and I say they're tied. I say they're just two sets of three films that honestly are the opposite in why they're wrong. Because I think the problem with The Rise of Skywalker and The Last Jedi and The Force Awakens is that they didn't have a plan. But yet, for the prequels, they absolutely had a plan, but they didn't have the execution. Now, I think the worst films do come in the prequels, but it's so hard to like the sequels when the Rise of Skywalker contradicts so much set up in the first two films. Um, eh, so it's tricky for me. It's tricky to note what my true stance aligns with these films, and I think I don't know. See, I don't I don't hate the cast. I don't hate the crew. I don't hate J.J. Abrams or Ryan Johnson or even Kathleen Kennedy. See, I think Kathleen Kennedy fails at the primary job of being an executive and running Lucasfilm, which is no having a plan for the company as a whole. Because they're supposed to do this stuff with the Game of Thrones creators. Nope, that's done. Creative differences. Someone was supposed to, Trevorrow was supposed to direct Rise of Skywalker. Oh, that's done. For some reason. No one, no, a lot of people don't like the Last Jedi. Oh, let's course correct. Let's completely scrap our plan, and let's make a plan that's lack thereof. So I think what's the cure for Star Wars, and that cure is probably, I think Jon Favreau is the perfect candidate because he loves Star Wars and he's just as much as a fan. Favreau's just as much as a fan as anyone else. And so I think he's been on every single side of a company, of a film business. He's been an actor, a director, a writer, an executive, a producer, a director. I think I said that again. So look, he's directed films like Elf and Iron Man. He starred in films like, Iron Man and he's voiced films and done all that stuff. He has produced things like The Mandalorian. He's been an executive on stuff like The Mandalorian. And see, a lot of people are saying Dave Filoni, and I've said that before, but I realize now Dave Filoni's a great creatively, but he might not be great executively because you need to be a businessman to run a company. I think Dave Filoni is not a businessman. No, he's great with Star Wars. He's a great creative director, but he's not a businessman. Jon Favreau's proven to run not a business, but he's proven to run organization. He's proven to run the Mandalorian ship very nicely. So he's been on the business side and he's been on the creative side, and he's passionate about Star Wars and he loves Star Wars and he's been working with Star Wars for so long. He's working with Disney for even longer. He's the one that kicked off the MCU, the director that kicked off the MCU. And so he's worked with Disney, he's worked with Star Wars, passionate about Star Wars, has been on every aspect of a film business, an executive, a producer, a director, a writer, an actor, an executive. So I think he's a candidate. So as far as which is better, prequel, sequels, I think they're pretty much tied for worst. They're not tied for best at all. Original trilogy is the gold standard, will never be topped. I'd say this. The original Star Wars films are here. Revenge of the Sith is here. More like here. You got Force Awakens is a little bit lower. Rogue One's probably about here. They're pretty close. Then you got Last Jedi's more like here. Then the other two prequels are probably here. And then Rise of Skywalker is probably lower here, or Rise of Skywalker is probably like here. This is probably the difference. So I don't know, but yeah, we'll see what happens. Stay tuned for videos coming right at you.